Aha, the French Revolution. One of the darkest yet most thrilling times in history. It might sound like a distant fairy tale to you, but know that those days still feel fresh in my heart. Now, close your eyes and listen closely. I'm going to take you back in time to the chaotic and passionate days of 1789. France. At that time, it was like a massive pot ready to boil over. But do you know what was bubbling beneath the surface? Three classes: the nobility, the clergy, and the common people. Each lived such different lives. While kings and aristocrats held lavish balls in their magnificent palaces, the common people were drowning in poverty and struggling against hunger. Those palaces, like Versailles, might have been splendid, but I knew whispers were rising behind their walls. The fall of the common people was just a matter of time. At this point, I want to take you into the depths of the revolution, onto the streets of France. Imagine people filled with hunger and anger in the narrow stone streets of Paris. Life in those streets was anything but easy, in stark contrast to the palace's glitter. The people, unable to find bread, were eagerly waiting for a spark. And as someone who witnessed every moment of that time, I saw how that spark turned into a wildfire. And then there was King Louis XVI, weak and indecisive, yet in charge of that vast France. I could feel the anxiety within him, the fear hidden behind the majestic portraits in his palace. A great kingdom was on the brink of collapse, but no one truly realized it. I experienced the people and events of that time one by one. Remember this, great events in history often start with small sparks. The French Revolution was no different. Perhaps it was hunger, perhaps poverty, or maybe the desperate anger of the people. Whatever the cause, this revolution was a necessity, a cry for change. And I felt the echoes of that cry, and the stone walls of Paris' voices were rising. A furious crowd shouting justice, equality. But how did it all begin? Why were people so angry? Let me tell you this story in detail. The dark clouds over France were slowly thickening. Nobles and clergy were living in wealth, while the common people felt like they were stuck in the mud. These three classes weren't just parts of a social structure, they symbolized separate and divided worlds. The nobles, those extravagant balls and chateaux, they were just as arrogant and disconnected from the people. The clergy, representing God, grew richer and more powerful every day, placing heavy burdens on the shoulders of the people. And the common folks, that poor populace, their eyes darkened from hunger, struggling to survive in the cold. But there was another force fueling the revolution: enlightenment, new ideas, the thought of a world governed by human reason and logic. These confusing ideas spread across France like a storm. Human fate shouldn't be ruled by God or the king, but by reason, right? The people now wanted not just bread, but justice too. Freedom, equality, brotherhood. These words began to echo in the minds of the people. But the monarchy didn't hear them, and even if they did, they didn't want to understand. Do you know, while France was bubbling with these ideas, an economic crisis was sweeping through the country? Debts, those damn debts. The splendor of the palaces, the never-ending costs of wars. King Louis sat in his palace, unsure of what to do. A king should be powerful and decisive, shouldn't he? But Louis, poor Louis, he was indecisive and timid. While the people of his country were writhing in hunger, the king closed his eyes, hoping the problems would resolve themselves. But the harsh realities couldn't be ignored. It might sound almost impossible to you, right? All of France was caught in the grip of an economic crisis, battling hunger. The people were already ready to revolt. That's how it all began. Just a little more patience. This story's just getting started. We'll slowly dive deeper. French society. It shines on the outside like a magnificent diamond, but inside it's filled with cracks, fragile and restless. The balance of this three-class society seemed to hang by a thread. Close your eyes and picture that time. You're walking through the streets of Paris on one side, nobles returning to their palaces in flashy carriages on the other side, priests mumbling prayers as they enter the church, but most strikingly, the ordinary people struggling with hunger, their hands calloused, looking on with hopeless eyes. France was truly divided like this. The first of these three classes is the nobility. That elite group boasting about their magnificent castles, satin dresses, and gold-plated belongings. Their lives were so extravagant that they acted as if they were completely unaware of the sufferings in the world. Imagine a young noble gliding at a royal ball, dazzling with silky wigs and lace-trimmed jackets, right? But we mustn't forget that behind those nobles lay a deep-seated corruption and greed. They were like parasites, living off the backs of the common people, sucking their blood. Taxes, yes, the heaviest taxes were always piled on the shoulders of the people. while the nobles carried almost none of the burden. They closed their eyes to the struggles of the public just to maintain their own comfort. They were lost in their own world, in their balls, parties behind the high walls of their palaces. And what about the clergy? Those priests, bishops, and church leaders in the grand cathedrals placing heavy responsibilities on the necks of the people. Yes, they too were living far removed from the public. They claimed to be the voice of God, but their voice echoed more of a cunning pursuit of gold and power. The church exploited the conscience of society, forcing the people into obedience and submission. Be patient, they said, God will reward you in heaven, but the people's stomachs weren't getting filled with patience, were they? Just like the nobles, the clergy was privileged and exempt from taxes. While the weight was placed on the backs of the people, the churchmen were living in luxury, trying to keep the people under control with the power of religion. And then, the people. That desperate populace. Mothers, children, and workers with eyes darkened by hunger, unable to find bread, and those crumbling village houses, bodies shivering in the cold. The people were fighting for survival. They had received no share of wealth and had been rendered powerless. They worked for days, sweating in the fields, but earned almost nothing in return. As I wandered those streets, I could feel the hopelessness on their faces, the pain in their eyes, the anger. These three classes, the nobility, the clergy, and the people. The chasm between them grew deeper every day. The nobles were getting richer, the clergy gaining more power, while the people were being pushed towards death by hunger. But the king, King Louis XVI, poor Louis was blind to this chasm, or even if he saw it, he couldn't do anything about it. Thinking about his inability to make decisions while sitting on the throne makes my heart ache. He was ruling over all of France, but his heart was filled not with a king's courage, but with fear. Louis's palace, Versailles. That splendid, magnificent palace with its gilded rooms. But sadly, this grandeur couldn't hide the realities of France. Louis was a weak king, indecisive and hesitant. During his reign, France was suffocating under massive debts, the costs of wars that had gone on for centuries, the struggle to maintain the splendor of Versailles, and the uprisings all over France. All these had turned the country's finances upside down, and the one who was supposed to manage that enormous crisis was Louis, but sadly, Louis didn't have the power to bear such a massive burden. France was not only struggling with an economic crisis, but hunger, famine, and misery were spreading in all directions. Fields were drying up, bread prices were skyrocketing, and every bite the people took felt more and more painful. The streets of France were filled with a murmur at that time. The people were hungry, angry, and worst of all, hopeless. Under these conditions, the lavish balls held in the palace had become an even greater symbol of injustice in the eyes of the people. Everything was so unbalanced that the day of reckoning was near. And when that day came, not even the gold plating of the palaces would be able to stop the revolution. But as if all this wasn't enough, there was also the idea of the Enlightenment. The power of those ideas. New thoughts that stirred up storms in people's minds, breaking down taboos. Liberty, equality, fraternity. These words began to circulate among the people. The Enlightenment was like a lightning bolt illuminating France's dark sky. Voltaire, Rousseau, Diderot. These names were like torches reshaping the future of France. The people were now asking for not just bread, but justice as well. As the idea of the Enlightenment spread throughout France, the people's desire for freedom grew stronger. They no longer believed that the king was chosen by God. They wanted to take their destinies into their own hands. And here comes the American Revolutionary War. Those days. France had helped America, standing by their side in the fight against the British. But sadly, America's victory had come at a huge cost for France. The financial burden brought on by that war had plunged France deeper into an economic crisis. But the American Revolution had also inspired the French people. They started to think, if the Americans can fight for freedom, why can't we? The American Revolution had sparked a fire in the minds of the French revolutionaries. That spark would soon turn into a blazing fireball. And so France was being swept towards a hurricane. The imbalance among the three classes, the economic crisis, the influence of Enlightenment thought, and inspiration from the American Revolution. All these elements came together to light the fuse for the French Revolution. 1789. What a huge year, what a tumultuous time. Whenever I think back to those days, the echoes in my memory, the sounds of footsteps in the streets, and the rising anger of the people transport me right back to those chaotic moments. Every corner of France felt like a volcano ready to erupt, just waiting for a revolution. And one of the key events that marked the beginning of it all was the convening of the Estates General. The Estates General hadn't met in a long time. In fact, the last time this assembly gathered was back in 1614. Can you imagine? For 175 years, France was ruled under the king's absolute power. The voices of the people were unheard, and the demands of the nobility and clergy were completely ignored. But now things had changed. France's economy had collapsed, the people were writhing in hunger, and the monarchy was drowning in debt. In this desperation, King Louis XVI decided to bring together representatives from all over the country. That was the reason for the convening of the Estates General, a massive financial crisis, and an anger among the people ready to explode. At the start of this meeting, everyone was hopeful. Nobles, clergy, and representatives of the Third Estate, the common people, gathered at the Palace of Versailles. The king believed this meeting would solve the debt issues that were dragging the country into a dead end. When I think back to that time, I can picture the crowd in the Grand Hall of Versailles. The nobles with their lavish robes, the priests with their crosses, and the representatives of the people, faces filled with worry and hearts ignited with the fire of struggle. Ah, what a contrast, what a tension. But this meeting quickly turned into chaos, contrary to everyone's hopes. The process that began in May 1789 led France into a complex period filled with political strife. The Third Estate, the representatives of the people, no longer wanted to accept the injustices being done to them. Back then, each class had one vote in the assembly. The nobles one vote, the clergy one vote, and the common people one vote. But this meant that the demands of the common people would never be met, because the nobles and clergy would always team up to block the Third Estate's demands. Imagine the very people carrying the weight of France were denied the power to make decisions about their own fate. This injustice ignited the fuse for the political conflicts in May. The Third Estate began to raise their voices against this system. We are the people. We are the majority. Therefore, we should make our own decisions, they cried out. But the nobles and clergy turned a deaf ear to these demands. Even King Louis struggled to reign in this rebellion. Tensions rose every day, and France's future hung by a thread. And right in the midst of this chaos, the Third Estate took a bold step. They established the National Assembly. This assembly would truly represent the people of France. Decisions would no longer be made solely by the nobles and the church. The people would have a say too. Of course, this move shook the monarchy. King Louis XVI hadn't expected such a challenge. The doors of the palace were shut to the representatives of the Third Estate. Instead of stepping back, they gathered elsewhere and took the famous tennis court oath, yes. They swore on the tennis court that they wouldn't disperse until they had defended the rights of the people. A storm was brewing in the streets of France. This oath was, in fact, the true beginning of the revolution. And then, that great day arrived, July 14, 1789. Aha! The storming of the Bastille. The Bastille, a grim and dark prison rising in the middle of Paris, had become a symbol of the people's anger. This storming was essentially a symbolic beginning of the revolution. Picture the crowd spilling into the streets, armed with stones, sticks, a few rifles. But their most powerful weapon was their rage. Years of pent-up hunger, poverty, and injustice crashed against the walls of the Bastille. That day, the people had reached the end of their patience. The Bastille was not just a prison. It was a symbol of the king's oppressive regime. Even though it housed only a few prisoners, the people's attack on this fortress shouted their rebellion against the monarchy. Conflicts broke out during the storming, blood was shed, but eventually the doors of the Bastille were broken down and the people declared their victory. Oh, whenever I think of that scene, the excitement within me reignites. As the towers of the Bastille crumbled, the old order of France began to shatter. This storming wasn't just about the destruction of a prison. It was a message demonstrating the people's power, and that the revolution was inevitable. There was no turning back. Even King Louis XVI was at a loss for what to do when he heard about the storming of the Bastille. The people had realized their own strength, and this power would forever change France. During those days when I walked the streets of Paris, I could feel the revolution permeating every corner. The fire in people's eyes, ignited further by the storming of the Bastille, was palpable. France had set off down an irreversible path. This storming became the symbol of the revolution, and from that moment on, the future of France was in the hands of the people. Ah, the founding of the National Assembly. Those days marked one of the sharpest turning points in history. I remember how this monumental decision echoed within the grand walls of the Palace of Versailles, shaking the foundations of a system that had been in place for centuries. After years of injustice, hunger, and oppression, the people were no longer willing to bow down. The establishment of the National Assembly was the most tangible step in this uprising. Everything started with that famous tennis court oath when the doors of the palace were shut to the representatives of the Third Estate. There was no fear in their eyes. On the contrary, this rejection only made them stronger. They gathered in a gymnasium and swore an oath. We, the representatives of the people, will not leave until we have rebuilt France's future with that oath. The National Assembly was born. This assembly became the greatest force standing against centuries of injustice in France. At that moment, the fate of the French people changed. It would now be the voice of the people, not the kings, that mattered. This new assembly was more than just a name. They fundamentally changed France's social structure by abolishing feudal rights. Feudal rights. When I think of those days, I remember the peasants of France, the people sweating in the fields. For centuries, they lived tied to the nobility, working their lands, barely managing to survive through the taxes they paid. The feudal system had burdened the peasants, ensuring the comfort of the nobility. But the National Assembly was determined to tear down that system. Land would no longer belong solely to the nobles. Peasants would also be owners of the land they worked for with their own sweat. The abolition of feudal rights was a revolutionary decision, not just for the peasants but for the future of France. This decision broke the chains of an entire country, not just a single class. No one would be anyone else's slave anymore. Freedom and equality would be the rights of all. And it was at this point that perhaps the most significant document of the French Revolution emerged, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. This declaration was a great revolution not only for France but for the world. It proclaimed the principles of equality, liberty, and fraternity to all humanity. I remember the hopeful glints in the eyes of those reading the declaration back then. It emphasized that everyone was equal and that their inherent rights would be protected by the state. The hierarchy, where kings, nobles, and the clergy stood above the people, was being dismantled. From now on, every individual, regardless of their class, would have the same rights. These ideas spread beyond France's borders, ushering humanity into a new era under the light of this declaration. However, the freedoms brought by this new order also led to significant tension. Particularly, the old alliance between the church and the state began to crack. That ancient bond between the church and the state in France. For centuries, the church had not only managed faith as France's spiritual leader, but had also been a significant player in politics. Kings had strengthened their thrones by leaning on the church, yet the revolution was determined to sever these ties. The tension between the church and the state was one of the most complex conflicts of the revolution. The church was one of the most powerful and entrenched institutions in France. Religion was a force that shaped the deepest beliefs of the people, and the revolution sought to strip that power away. The National Assembly argued that the church's privileges should end, and religion should be separated from state affairs. This decision met with fierce resistance from the church because it held tremendous wealth and power. For centuries, it had owned land and financed itself through the people's taxes. However, the revolution abolished these privileges, allowing people to practice their faith independently of the state. But this separation was not easy. The confiscation of church property and the control of clergy by the state led to significant turmoil. Resistance began across France, especially in rural areas, against this decision. Although people had lived under the church's pressure, they reacted against having their faith so harshly changed by the revolution. Still, the revolution did not back down. The separation of the church and state became one of the greatest victories of the French Revolution, laying the groundwork for the principle of secularism, one of the foundations of modern democracies. When I think of this period, I feel the deep effects of these revolutionary steps echoing throughout every corner of France. The founding of the National Assembly, the abolition of feudal rights, the acceptance of the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, and the tension between the church and the state. They were all parts of a grand revolution. France was no longer the old France. Centuries of injustices were coming to an end, and the doors to a new era were opening. Those initial steps of the revolution would eventually grow like an avalanche, shaking not just France but the whole world. I remember that night. The night of Verens. The desperate plan King Louis XVI and his family made to escape the palace on that quiet, dark night. Throughout history, kings have fought great battles to protect their thrones, but Louis, his fight was different. He was a king who had lost the trust of his people, and his kingdom was slowly crumbling. The people were hungry, the lands were barren, and the palace walls could no longer ensure his safety. France was no longer the France it used to be. The fire of revolution was burning everywhere. The king planned to escape the country as a last hope for survival, but fate would take him down a very different path that night. The escape toward Verens. When the king and his family dressed in plain clothes and got into a carriage, they felt hopeful. As they left the palace, it was perhaps the last time Louis saw the lights of Paris. Their goal was to cross the border and regain control of France with the help of foreign powers. However, what king could rise again in the eyes of the people after having lost their trust? Until the darkness fell that night, the roads were empty. Silence enveloped everything. But in a village square in Verens, Louis's face would be recognized. and chaos would erupt in France. I remember when the king's carriage was stopped in the village of Varennes. Louis's face was no longer able to hide from the people. The king was captured and brought back with his family. At that moment, France's fate changed. The ancient belief that kings were untouchable was shattered among the people once again. The Varennes incident was not just a turning point for a revolution, it was a death sentence for a monarchy. Louis's escape had failed, and the throne was now undeniably shaking. But this was just the beginning. After the escape attempt at Varennes, confidence in the monarchy in France was completely destroyed. Until that day, Louis had been held as a kind of symbolic leader in the search for a constitutional monarchy. However, this escape attempt clearly showed that he and his family wanted to leave France, that he wanted to abandon his people. In the eyes of the public, there was no longer a place for the king. The monarchy was on its last breath. And then in 1792, that great day arrived. France took the most radical step in its history by ending a millennium of monarchy and declaring the Republic, the French Republic. This was a revolutionary step not only for France but for the whole world. A land once ruled by kings, nobles, and the church was now under the control of the people. I remember the joyous shouts echoing through the streets of Paris during those days. The hopeful gazes of the people felt like the victory of the revolution with every step. France was undergoing a profound change not only politically but socially as well. The privileges of the nobles and the clergy were being dismantled one by one, and for the first time, the people could see that they could shape their own destiny. There was no longer a king, there was a republic. However, the revolution wasn't going to stop there. With the declaration of the Republic, eyes turned back to Louis XVI. He had tried to escape, stabbing his people in the back. Now he too had to face the consequences of this revolution. King Louis would be tried. Yes, the very thought of trying a king was unimaginable at that time. But the French people had started their own revolution, and this revolution required the trial of Louis. In the courtroom that day, Louis was perhaps more alone than he had ever felt in his life. Before his people, the man who had once been an absolute ruler now stood humbled before a court. For the demands of the people were clear, they wanted justice. In the courtroom, Louis tried to appear calm. However, he couldn't hide the fear in his eyes, the uncertainty of the future. That day, not just Louis, but centuries of France were on trial. The monarchy, the absolute power of the nobles, all of it ended in the person of Louis in that courtroom. And finally, when the court's decision was announced, perhaps one of the most dramatic scenes in history unfolded. Louis XVI was condemned to death for treason against his country. In an era where kings were deemed untouchable, a king being executed by his people. This was the greatest spark of the revolutionary fire. It was January of 1793. On that cold winter day, the square in Paris was packed. The people had gathered to watch the execution of Louis XVI. In the streets where kings once strolled, now a king would give his life before the public. When Louis was brought to the center of the square, he tried to maintain his composure. But as he walked toward the guillotine, a sense of victory spread through the crowd with each step. That blade, which would be placed around the necks of kings, not only marked the end of one man, but also the end of centuries of absolute rule. When Louis's head fell, there was a deep silence in the square. At that moment, an era ended for France, and a new age began. The monarchy had ended, and the Republic was born. But this was just the beginning, because the revolution in France was far from over. The fire of revolution would blaze even brighter, stirring storms that would radically change world history. When I think of those days, I feel the magnitude of the revolution and the desperation of Louis in those final moments in every detail. There was no longer a king in France, but the spirit of hope and freedom brought by the revolution was felt everywhere. France would never be the same again. Here we are in the most complex, grim, and yet fascinating period of the French Revolution. The rise of the Jacobins and their charismatic yet harsh leader, Maximilien Robespierre. At this stage of the revolution, France underwent another significant transformation. But this time, the passionate dreams of freedom that fueled the revolution gave way to terror and fear. The fire of liberty that burned in the hearts of the people now flickered in the shadows of the guillotine's blade. Robespierre. Every time I mention his name, I feel the determination and deep conviction of that man who was both the savior and the destroyer of the revolution. Robespierre was the leader of the Jacobins. He emerged as one of the most fervent defenders of the revolution. He was the voice of the people, carrying the spirit of the revolution. Yet, ironically, this great revolutionary became a prisoner of the very revolution he helped create. While advocating for freedom and the rights of the people, Robespierre also believed that any sacrifice could be made for the sake of the revolution. Among these sacrifices, the greatest was bloodshed. At the beginning of the revolution, hopes for liberty and equality were blooming in the hearts of the people. But over time, things changed. France was plunged into a civil war, a bloody conflict erupted between those supporting the revolution and the counter-revolutionaries. At this point, Robespierre decided that radical measures were necessary to protect the future of the country. Thus began the Reign of Terror. According to Robespierre, every element threatening the revolution had to be eliminated. But these threats weren't just external, they were lurking within France itself. So Robespierre and the Jacobins took action using terror and violence to eradicate these threats. Terror became an inevitable tool to protect the revolution. The sharp blade of the guillotine was now targeting not just kings and nobles, but also the revolution's own children. Ah, that chilling sound of the guillotine. Every day in the squares of Paris, dozens, even hundreds of people were sent under that cold blade. The sharp steel of the guillotine had become a symbol of both justice and terror in the eyes of the public. Anyone thought to have betrayed the revolution, whether noble or an ordinary citizen, was losing their life under this ruthless device. During the Reign of Terror, while the word freedom echoed everywhere, each individual learned just how heavy the price of that freedom could be. As Robespierre's determination reshaped France, it turned the country into a literal bloodbath. One of the key figures of this period was Georges Danton. Danton. Ah, that brave, loud-voiced man. Danton had been a beacon of hope for the people since the early days of the revolution, fueling the revolutionary fire. Unlike Robespierre, Danton was a more pragmatic revolutionary. He prioritized people's lives, arguing that the revolution shouldn't succumb to terror. However, as the Reign of Terror progressed, Robespierre and Danton's paths diverged. When Danton began to oppose the terror policies, his fate was to meet the guillotine as well, even in those last moments, as he walked toward the guillotine. Danton's courage to cry out to the crowd for the future of the revolution showed just how tragic an end a revolutionary could face. And then there was Jean-Paul Marat. Marat was one of the most radical voices of the revolution. He was a great hero to the people, yet he was also one of the most feared by his enemies. Marat justified all forms of violence to defend the revolution. His fiery writings and speeches would incite the masses, yet Marat's tragedy was being stabbed to death in his home by an assassin. His death became another symbol of how perilous the position of even the revolution's leaders could be. This assassination led to an intensification of the revolution's violence. But as with every revolution, there were counter-movements. Counter-revolutionary uprisings erupted all over France. This posed a significant threat to the revolutionaries. Civil wars engulfed every corner of the country. In some places, royalists fought against the revolution, while in others, the nobility resisted. France was under attack from both within and outside. As they battled external enemies, divisions among the people were growing internally. Civil wars resulted in bloodshed throughout the nation. The people were forced to fight both against revolutionary armies and counter-revolutionaries. Robespierre continued to wield terror as a weapon to eliminate these threats. However, the tragic irony was that Robespierre could no longer control his own revolution. Terror was everywhere, and his once advocating rhetoric for freedom and equality had given way to a regime ruled by fear and violence. Everything could be sacrificed in the name of protecting the revolution. Yet at this point, Robespierre began to lose the trust of the people. Ah, those days, the dark times when terror overshadowed the revolution, and the people lived in a mix of hope and fear. Robespierre's revolution had lost sight of that pure vision of liberty and equality it once had. The absence of Danton and Marat, the civil wars, the rise of counter-revolutionary movements led to the elimination of even those defending the revolution one by one. In France, the very word freedom began to be associated with blood. But like every reign of terror, this period too had an end. Robespierre was crushed under the weight of the revolution he had created. His end came just like Danton and the other revolutionaries with the guillotine. The people could no longer withstand the terror. The revolution had consumed its own children, but a new order was established in France. This period of the French Revolution was perhaps one of the bloodiest and most radical transformations in human history. The rise of the Jacobins, Robespierre's leadership, and the tragic fates of revolutionaries like Danton and Marat profoundly changed France, not just politically, but socially as well. Ah, yes, the fire of the French Revolution was starting to burn not just France, but all of Europe. At the beginning of the revolution, the enthusiastic calls for freedom and equality threatened not only the French people, but also the thrones of all monarchies. The overthrow of kings and nobles and the uprising of the people to establish a republic was a significant source of fear for Europe's established monarchies. And so the old kings, queens, dukes, and lords gathered together to extinguish this revolutionary fire in France, uniting to protect their thrones. The great powers of Europe, Austria, Prussia, England, Spain, and Russia were closely watching what was happening in France, fearing that the revolution might spread to their own lands. If the French people could overthrow their kings, why couldn't the German or Spanish people do the same? The waves of this revolution could spread across Europe. That's why the monarchies decided to unite for their protection. For them, the French Revolution was not just an internal matter, it was a fire threatening the entire European order, and the only way to put out that fire was to go to war against France. This was a significant turning point for France. External threats were now at the doorstep. Enemy armies were advancing on the borders of revolutionary France. Prussia and Austria launched their attacks from the east, while England took to the seas against France. Struggling with these external threats, France was also experiencing chaos and division internally. Instead of uniting the country, the revolution seemed to be tearing it apart. Civil wars, counter-revolutionary uprisings, economic collapse. France was under siege from both inside and outside. This situation turned into a complete survival struggle for the French revolutionaries. They had to either protect the revolution or let the monarchies crush this newly born republic. Yet, despite everything, the revolution managed to survive. At this point, the revolutionary armies became France's saviors. The people decided to arm themselves and go to the front lines for national unity and the continuation of the revolution. Battles that had previously relied on a professional army were now based on the power of the people. Volunteers from all corners of France joined the army. Farmers, workers, craftsmen. They all rushed to the front lines to ensure the revolutionary fire wouldn't be extinguished. This was a popular war against the European monarchies. The revolutionary armies. Their courage, their determination. These soldiers coming from every corner of France were not just fighting for their country but also defending revolutionary ideals, freedom, equality, and brotherhood. They didn't hesitate to lay down their lives for these ideals on the battlefield. And a miracle happened. The revolutionary armies started to push back the massive monarchist forces opposing them. The strongest armies in Europe had to retreat against a people ignited by the fire of revolution. The Austrian and Prussian armies were pushed back from France's eastern borders, and the British naval forces suffered heavy defeats along France's coasts. France began to overcome both its internal enemies and the giant coalition of monarchies outside. These military successes of France were achieved not only through military strategy but also through the tremendous motivation created by revolutionary ideals. The people's desire to determine their own fate made them invincible. On the battlefields, it wasn't just armies fighting. It was a battle of revolutionary spirit. Each soldier fought with the belief of protecting freedom and equality. The revolutionary armies became symbols of freedom. France was defending not just a country against the monarchies in Europe, but an entire revolutionary movement. And this struggle shaped not only France's destiny, but also the future of all Europe. France's military successes safeguarded the revolution and pushed it further. The victories against the united forces of European monarchies gave great confidence to the revolutionary government. France was now not just protecting its own territory, but also pursuing a strategy aimed at spreading the revolution. Revolutionary ideas were about to spread across Europe along with France's armies. France had become not only the defender of the revolutionary republic, but also the bearer of these ideals. And then came that moment. The victories of France's revolutionary armies not only protected its borders but also demonstrated the power of the revolution to all of Europe. The monarchies of Europe began to fear this new power of the people. No throne was safe anymore. The fire of revolution rose once more, and France's victories ensured that the revolution echoed not just in France but throughout Europe. The old order of Europe was starting to tremble in the face of this new revolutionary power. France had survived civil wars and counter-revolutionary threats, and was now ready to spread revolutionary ideals across all of Europe. The revolution had crossed its borders. As France's armies charged from victory to victory, calls for freedom and equality spread to every corner of Europe. Robespierre. He was one of those big storms that time brought along. In the chaotic and tumultuous times of the French Revolution, this man emerged claiming to be the voice of the people and quickly rose to the pinnacle of power. Once a young lawyer who promised freedom and equality for the people and wielded the sword of justice, how did he become a symbol of fear and death? That's one of history's interesting twists. By 1793, the revolution had turned into a whirlwind beginning to swallow France. The Jacobins, the most radical representatives of the revolution, came together under Robespierre's leadership and established a so-called dictatorship in the name of the people. But no matter how much a dictatorship claims to be for the people, it eventually becomes a chain around the people's necks. Robespierre was the architect of this Jacobin dictatorship. The Reign of Terror, initiated under the pretext of protecting the revolution, marked a time when the revolution lost its purpose and fear reigned in place of freedom. People fought to keep the ideals of the revolution alive, but they faced the guillotine for those very ideals. The guillotine. With each drop of that cold, merciless device, another head fell, and another hope faded away. As the strongest leader of the Jacobins, Robespierre governed this era of terror with an iron fist. He didn't hesitate to send thousands of people to their deaths in the name of punishing the enemies of the people. What started as an effort to protect this dictatorship quickly transformed into a machine of oppression. Now, the ideals of the revolution were dedicated not to the peace of the people, but to preserving the Jacobins' power. However, the course of history is always changing. The reign of cruelty cannot last forever. No matter how strong, every dictatorship eventually falls due to its own contradictions. By 1794, we reached that historic turning point when this empire of fear came to an end. The Thermidorian reaction. Robespierre and the Jacobins began to find themselves trapped in the wheel of fear they had created. The sound of that harsh justice, the guillotine that mercilessly sent people to their deaths, eventually turned on them as well. On July 27, 1794, the people had finally overcome their fear and took action to reclaim the revolution for themselves. Robespierre was no longer the source of fear. He had become its victim. Once the most powerful man of the revolution, this leader was arrested and sent to the guillotine amidst the Thermidorian reaction. He had sent many to their deaths with the guillotine's decree, and now its cold embrace awaited him. On July 28, 1794, when Robespierre's head fell to the guillotine, the reign of terror came to an end. Robespierre's execution marked the beginning of a new era in France. The reign of terror had ended, and a new political structure was born. After the revolution, the people could finally breathe again, but that breath always carried the shadow of Robespierre. His story remained a reminder of how great ideals can turn into dictatorship during the turbulent years of the French Revolution. After Robespierre was sent to the guillotine, France was once again thrown into chaos. With the end of Jacobin dictatorship, the revolution started searching for a new direction. But finding balance this time wasn't easy at all. In 1795, a 5-member governing body was established, the Directory. Yes, this 5-member group emerged as a sort of new hope and unifying force for the young revolution. The Directory aimed to establish order in France after the revolution. However, the chaos born from the revolution and the problems accumulated over the years posed a huge burden for this government. Economic turmoil, social tensions, and political maneuvering were still ongoing across the country. Just think about it, the revolution started with such great hopes, and the people had finally freed themselves from the monarchy. But now, under this new government, those hopes seemed unfulfilled. The economic struggles were deep, bread prices were soaring, and people couldn't even meet their basic needs. Meanwhile, wars were still raging on, and more money was needed to feed the army and finance the conflicts. These difficulties had worn the people down. Political instability was another significant wound. Everyone had a different vision for France. Some wanted to restore the monarchy. Royalists were chasing after this dream. Even among those who once supported the revolution, dreams of monarchy were starting to take root again. In fact, royalist uprisings were beginning to break out. The Vendémiaire uprising of 1795, a desperate attempt by royal supporters in Paris, clearly showed that those dreaming of the old regime were resurfacing. However, these royalist efforts were suppressed, but the atmosphere didn't fully calm down. On the other side were the Jacobins. They were also not willing to compromise their revolutionary dreams. The shadow of the reign of terror still loomed over them, but it wasn't enough to silence them. Jacobin uprisings occasionally flared up. Those wanting to carry on the radical legacy of the revolution saw the new government as a threat and wanted to rekindle the excitement from the early days of the revolution. Ironically, after Robespierre, both former royal supporters and the most radical Jacobins were rising up against this 5-member directory. France had truly turned into a stage of contradictions. Amid all this turmoil, serious deviations from the principles of the revolution were taking place. Remember those great words that became the rallying cry at the start of the revolution: liberty, equality, fraternity? Well, those words were beginning to lose their meaning. The Directory was struggling not to uphold the ideals of the revolution, but rather to maintain its own power. The revolution was no longer in the hands of the people. It belonged to a handful of elites. While the public suffered in poverty, politicians were embroiled in power struggles among themselves. It felt like the enthusiastic days of the revolution were far behind. Although the Directory was established to bring stability to France, this period of government turned out to be a complete disappointment. Royalists wanting to restore the monarchy, Jacobins pushing for a radical continuation of the revolution, and a populace grappling with economic difficulties. All these issues left the Directory on shaky ground, and in such chaos, power can't last for long. France was once again on the brink of a bigger change. Napoleon Bonaparte. This young and ambitious military leader of France rose like a shining star amidst the chaos of the revolution. During the painful days of the revolution, he caught attention with his skills and determination within the army. But who could have guessed that this young officer would one day leave his mark on history as the Emperor of the French? The chaotic atmosphere of the revolution paved the way for Napoleon's power and ambition. Let's dive into this story together. While the French Revolution raged on, Napoleon embarked on the Italian campaign as a defender of revolutionary principles. At that time, he was still a young general, but his intelligence and strategic brilliance quickly made his name known throughout France. The Italian campaign was like a stage where Napoleon made his debut. With his victories against the Italian city-states and Austria, he won the love of the people and solidified the army's confidence in him. But this was not just a military success. Napoleon also won the hearts and minds of the people in Italy during this campaign by implementing reforms and spreading revolutionary ideals there. Under his leadership, France was not only a military power, but also a force spreading the spirit of the revolution. At that time, Napoleon was seen as a true hero of the revolution in the eyes of the people, a figure who would bring hope to chaotic France. But Napoleon was more than just a soldier. He had much bigger plans in mind. By 1799, France was still reeling from the effects of the revolution. Facing economic issues, political instability, and rising threats from all sides, the country was once again searching for a savior. It was at this moment that Napoleon stepped onto the scene and seized power with the coup of Brumaire. I remember those chaotic days well. Many people in the upper echelons of France initially viewed Napoleon's coup with skepticism. However, Napoleon was a leader who quickly captivated everyone. The coup of Brumaire was perhaps one of the last turning points of the French Revolution. Napoleon had not ended the revolution, rather, he had made it more disciplined and controllable. Thus began the Consulate period. This new government aimed to move away from the chaotic days of the revolution and bring stability and order to France. Napoleon was solidifying his power as the first consul. People began to see him as the architect of a new order. But for Napoleon, that wasn't enough. His imperial dreams held a grand vision that transcended the boundaries of the revolution. In 1804, Napoleon declared himself Emperor of the French. Yes, the monarchy had been overthrown by the revolution in France, yet here was Napoleon crowning himself just a few years later. Isn't it ironic? Was the empire the end of the revolution? Or was it a new phase of the revolution? The answer to this question holds the key to understanding Napoleon's complex relationship with the revolution. He had brought the chaos and anarchy of the revolution under control, but as a monarch, he also revived traces of the old regime. However, Napoleon was not a traditional king. His leadership was an empire that aimed to preserve and spread the gains of the revolution. On one hand, the revolutionary principles of equality, brotherhood, and liberty were still alive. On the other hand, he held France together with a strong central authority. Napoleon's rise to emperor didn't mean the end of the revolution. On the contrary, under his rule, France would carry the revolution's legacy to new territories and spread the revolutionary fire across Europe in a different way. Yes, Napoleon's rise was not the end of the revolution, but it was a period of transformation for the revolution. The empire symbolized the desire to preserve the gains of the revolution while also making France a world power. A soldier born from the revolution had now become an emperor. But this was just one chapter in the story of the revolution. The French Revolution. Friends, what a massive upheaval it was. It didn't just shake France, it uprooted all of Europe and even societies in far-off lands. This great revolution carved its way into our minds, leaving an echo that would resonate for centuries. People stood up for rights and freedoms they had only dreamed of until that day, lighting the fuse for profound change. To truly grasp the impact of the revolution, you need to look not just at the streets of France, but at every corner of Europe and even the most distant lands in the world. First off, human rights. Oh, what a novel and radical concept it was in that era. When the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen was proclaimed alongside the French Revolution, it was the first time people's equality, freedom, and rights were voiced so loudly. The Declaration stated men are born and remain free and equal in rights. This was a moment when centuries of social hierarchies began to crumble. The privileged class who were born into monarchy and owned lands and wealth saw their world start to shake. These ideas didn't just resonate in France, they echoed across Europe. Societies where kings ruled and people bowed down were ripe for change. People were beginning to demand their rights. Equality and freedom were no longer just in the minds of philosophers, they were being shouted in the streets. Republicanism was another major legacy of the revolution. Sovereignty resides in the people. This was perhaps the greatest threat to monarchs who had sat on their thrones for centuries. Monarchies trembled in the face of these dangerous ideas spread by the revolution. Many kingdoms across Europe were gripped by fear after the revolution. This thought, born in France, gradually spread to other European societies. People were starting to realize that rulers shouldn't be there by divine right, but by the will of the people. Of course, monarchy would eventually return to France, but something had changed. The people had recognized where the real power lay, and this awareness would resonate across the continent. Then there was nationalism. During the revolution, the French discovered they were not just subjects of a king, but members of a nation. The revolution infused the concept of nation with a brand new meaning. People began to emphasize their ties to the land they were born on and their belonging to their people. This idea quickly took root in other parts of Europe as well. In Germany, Italy, and even distant corners of the Ottoman Empire, a wave of nationalism began to rise. Each nation started demanding its own freedom and independence. The Great Wave of the French Revolution laid the groundwork for movements that would redraw the world map. Every nation entered the fight to defend its identity and freedom. And what about the revolution's contributions to modern democracies? Friends, the democracy we know today was shaped by the steps taken during that time. Concepts like the will of the people, equal voting rights, freedom, and the rule of law emerged from the ideals of the revolution. The foundations of democratic governance around the world are rooted in the fiery ideas that rose during those days of the French Revolution. From the United States to independence movements in South America, you can see the echoes of this revolution everywhere. People should have the right to determine their own destinies, and the only thing that could ensure that was the power of the people. And that's the legacy of the French Revolution. This legacy wasn't just a revolution, it was one of the greatest ideological movements in world history. Human rights, republicanism, and nationalism. All of these concepts brewed within this great sequence of events, profoundly impacting every society across the globe. My friends, we've reached the end of our journey as we trace the footsteps of a monumental revolution. We've roamed through the fiery squares of the French Revolution, where cries for human rights, freedom, and equality echoed in the streets. We witnessed the rise and fall of Robespierre and the emergence of Napoleon. Together we explored how this revolution changed not just France, but the entire world. But remember, this grand story we call history isn't just hidden in the shadows of the past. It's a guide that shapes our present and even our future. The French Revolution is not just a thing of the past, it's a force that influences today and tomorrow. The fire of the struggle for human rights, freedom, and equality never went out. In each of our hearts, the ideals of the revolution still burn bright. So now I ask you, friends, what have you learned from this revolution? In today's world, how do we keep these great ideals alive? Just like we gather around a fire to share stories, we must carry and pass on the lessons we've learned from history to one another. If this narrative moved you, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. In our next journey, we'll dive into other depths of history. Until then, may the light of history always guide your path. Take care, and see you in the next story.